All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a New Evening Idol special interview series where I haven't done one in over 2 years. So please forgive me if I catch up on my skills there. But we have a very exciting person who is doing a very, very exciting project about a very, very exciting person throughout history that we will be talking with. So we're going to go over the magnum opus of Jan Křesadlo, who is a Czech writer and poet, among many other things, as both of us have learned. And we're going to talk about his magnum opus, Astronautilia, and more specifically, Mr. Ben Broadbent's English translation of it, which has been a feat in and of itself. So this poem is so obscure and so little known to the general public that Mr. Broadbent, and I'm sure other people will even ask me, how did I come across it? So my story with Jan Křesadlo started when I was doing closed bracket searches on people throughout history on Wikipedia. So I was doing closed bracket, person who achieved this, person who achieved that, person who had these characteristics, person who accomplished that. And I was always very interested in the Renaissance man archetype, or the Heinleinian hero, as Robert Heinlein put it, where the jack of all trades, your Leonardo da Vinci's, your Jean von Neumann's, your Thomas Young's. And then as that journey went on, I found about the works of Jan Křesadlo. And what really compelled me to share his work and Mr. Broadbent's work on Křesadlo is there was just one piece on his Wikipedia page that really, really resonated with me, which is it's written that he was fond of setting intense goals for himself, which I am a perfect victim of doing. And even for me, it's never been perfectly articulated on such a factual site such as Wikipedia. And that led to us going down his works and going down Astronautilia, which is now going to Mr. Ben Broadbent, who is doing an English translation of it that is unfinished, but it's perfectly right to do so because it is so complicated and so different from us today that I feel this really could benefit and really could intrigue people who are unfamiliar with this era of his. So we're here with Mr. Ben Broadbent of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having invited me as well. I'm always delighted to talk about this text in light of the fact, as you say, it is so frightfully obscure and something that I think should be much more well known. It's a totally unique work of literature. There is nothing else like it, as far as I'm aware, that has been composed within living memory. And I feel that if people were to know about this text and to know about this obscure, rather recherche ancient Greek epic composed 30 years ago, interest would balloon, curiosity would grow, people would want to read it. And since the epic is written originally in ancient Greek, with an accompanying Czech translation by the author, it's very hard to thumb through. Neither ancient Greek nor Czech are very widely spoken languages. Czech may have 10 million speakers in its in Czechia, but nobody really learns Czech outside of the country. And Greek is the preserve of universities and select schools at this stage, really, especially Homeric Greek, the dialect of Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. So therefore, this work is locked out of general discourse because nobody can really read either of those two languages. They're not widely taught or widely studied. English, by contrast, is the language. At this point, it is the lingua franca. And so I thought, well, I think that if there were to be an English translation, the text would appreciate in popularity. It would be accessible. People could work their way through an epic that will use Homer and wider Greek literature as readily as it will use more modern media like Star Trek and Doctor Who and other such sci-fi writers, of which I've certainly interest and I have varying degrees of knowledge. So it makes for a fantastic read when you're on the same page in the same text and the same passage. You can notice the author playing with both ancient literature and with modern science fiction, as well as several other things at one and the same time. It really is the work of a Renaissance man, and it is a work which demands an awful lot of its reader while being nonetheless a very entertaining tale.
So it's a work that's not only laborious in the writing and translating, but it's even laborious in reading it. So,
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't quite catch
so
you.
yeah, so it's a work that is not only laborious in writing and translating, but also even in reading it.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it is quite the pleasure to get through as both reader and yes, and also as translator. It's a wonderful thing to have a go at expressing in English because it's written in, yeah, as I just mentioned, particularly the epic dialect of ancient Greek, which is only used, as the name implies, for epics. It's a sort of Greek which is not one you would learn first off if you study ancient Greek in any institution. You'll begin with Attic Greek, the dialect of Athens, in which the philosophies and the plays are written. Epic Greek is one which must be learned separately and which is difficult to begin with. But when you get your head around it, it's perfectly straightforward. And Homer is, in particular is so formulaic, and so many of the same phrases and lines repeats that you get used to it quite quickly. Um, so trying to express the epic dialect of Greek and English is always a challenge. Many modern translators of Homer will deliberately translate the Homeric dialect into old-fashioned Shakespearean English. So they'll say, thy and thou and loveth and all this nonsense. I'm not doing that. I think that's illegible. I don't like it when translations archaic like that. I think it's obtuse. So I've rendered it in more modern English, something that would be intelligible to a person of the 21st century rather than of the 16th century. Um, since it was written by a man in the late 20th century, why would I at all want to translate it with language and linguistic features productive in a stage of English that's considerably predates the age of its composition? So I have worked to ensure that the translation will be as legible as it can be while also remaining poetic and metrical. I'm trying to produce a work of literature, not a crib. This is not simply a tool to read the Greek. Most people cannot read the Greek. This is meant to be a self-standing work of literature that reads in English as well as it might read in the Greek, if I can even begin to approach the complexity of the original composition.
Great, great. And so I guess now it's probably your turn for it to describe how did you first come across the author and his work of Astronautilia? What led you to that? What led you to that discovery?
Now that is a good story, which in part I regret to say is lost to the mists of time. That I have known about this poem for so long that I don't entirely remember where I found out about it. Um, as far as I know, I talked about the epic in my A-level Latin class with my teacher and my fellow students. For the benefit of Americans who may be watching this, A-levels are the school qualifications you do in the UK, where I'm from, between the ages of 16 and 18. So just before you go to university. So apparently in his class, as I mentioned the poem, I don't recall doing that. It meant though that yes, I knew about the text before I went to university. And what I do remember is that when I got to my undergrad to Oxford, in the first like 3 or 4 weeks of my time being there, I discovered that the Bodleian, the central library of the university, had 2 copies of the Astronautilia, which is quite fun. So I had one of them delivered to Classics Library. I took it over to my desk because I'd done a GCSE in ancient Greek. And for the American audience, again, a GCSE is an exam you do at the age of 16 before going on to do A levels from 16 to 18. So I had a GCSE in Greek. I had read 100 lines of Homer. I thought, oh, I can do this. I know what's going on. I can read Greek. I opened the text of the first page, couldn't read it. It's too hard. It was way beyond me. I was trying to get through just even the opening 7 or so lines. It just defeated me. I was beyond my remit. So I put the book back on the shelf. Returned it to deep storage and went along my merry way, realizing I needed to learn a bit more Greek before I approached it. And then over the next year and a half, I ended up studying Greek to a much higher level. I studied for a whole paper on Homer's Iliad, which involved reading 4 books of the Iliad in Greek. I got much better at reading the epic dialect. So in February of 2020, I got in touch with um, the author's son, a guy called Václav Pinkova, um, and asked him whether he had a copy of the text, and he sent me a PDF, which I began to look through when I was bored, revising for my exams that I had in March of 2020, which was a rather fortuitous time to do it because the world was ending at that moment. And the last thing that I ended up doing before that the pandemic struck and lockdown fell upon the UK was 2 weeks of exams, which was utterly brutal. But when I was free of those exams and I was at home, nothing else to do, I opened the PDF. And now, having done a whole paper on the Iliad, I studied the text more seriously. I began to translate it into English in a very rough, dreadful fashion that I shudder to look at again. Um, and come the summer, my pace began to increase. When restrictions had loosened and we were legally allowed to, I went to even visit the author's son and his mother, Křesadlo's widow, who lived just south of Oxford. So when I went down to Oxford to go and collect my belongings, which I had abandoned hastily because of the pandemic, I convinced my dad to take a detour to go and see the family. And then we sat in the garden for 2 hours talking over their late husband and father. At this, they very kindly gave me my copy of the poem, which I still have. Large book that it is. It comes in a sleeve. Here it is. It's an absolute page turner. Not page turner. Doorstop. Huge work. So I finally got a physical copy of the text in August of 2020. I went home. That considerably increased the pace of my translation because now I had a physical thing that I could leaf through. And by the end of, I think, September, I had produced a rough translation of the entire text into English. And in November, I then began to retranslate it into metrical English, which is the one that I'm trying to get published. And ever since then, I've been writing it with breaks on and off to take into account things like exams and university work and other such distractions over the past few years. But it has been a project that I've been engaged with pretty, throughout the past 4 or 5 years at this point. So it was originally a lockdown baby, which is now a lockdown toddler, and which is taking over my life because there is so much to say about it. And it is an endless joy to edit the translation, to revise it, to improve the English, and to correct all the errors that I find littered throughout the text as I go.
And the copy that his family gave you, was that the same translation or the same copy as the one you found on campus?
It was, yes. So this was the second time that I had physically interacted with a copy of the book. In fact, I even have two copies of this text. I got another one later on, so that's currently on a bookshelf somewhere else in the house. So yeah, that in itself is a point of note that the text was not very well printed. I think there are roughly 300 copies that were printed in total because they were shockingly, publishing a work in ancient Greek and Czech is not always a money spinner. So the publisher's going to go so far. It was produced in part, I believe, on a bank loan. So I think there are 300 copies in total, a large number of which were destroyed in a series of floods in Prague in the early 2000s. So having spoken to Václav, to the eldest son, he estimates, I think he's told me, he thinks there were probably 50 copies left in the world. It's not easy to get a hold of one. He has several more. He's got quite a few, which he's trying to sell to raise money for Ukraine in the war. But that's another reason why the text is not very widely known, because it's very hard to get access to it. Not only is it written in two languages that aren't very well known internationally, but the book is so bloody obscure. And the copies that I know of are either owned by the family, by enthusiasts such as myself, or by university libraries. And they're invariably kept in deep storage because it's shockingly not a text which people often access. So I do know where various copies are around the world, but it's not easy to get a hold of. You really have to struggle, find one, and often go straight to the family as your source.
And what about the author? What did you know about him either before or shortly after your first encounter with the book? And what about it, like, has anything about his life changed as you've translated it again and again? Has that changed at all? Has that been a journey?
So I didn't know an awful lot about him when I first started off because he's not a well-known author even in the Czech-speaking world, being an exile who lived in Britain and published in Czech, so therefore obscure in Britain for having written in Czech, obscure in his home country because he died in '95, so it was not too long after communism had fallen. So there wasn't enough time for him to really rebuild his reputation back home. I knew very little about him. Whatever information I could find online on various websites, Wikipedia page was the best source at the time, and in many regards it still is. I found various short articles about him here and there. It wasn't very much. Most of what I learned about him came from the family. Um, there does not exist a biography of this man. His novels will have brief summaries of his life here and there, um, but there is no major resource to learn more about him other than going straight to the family. So from the family, I have picked up things about him, and I've learned more about what he was like and the way in which he thought and he wrote. Um, I wouldn't say it's had an enormous impact on my translation. It means that I can recognize more of what he's doing in the translation. Like he has passages where he's riffing on communism and capitalism. And now that I know more about him, I can understand why he's doing that more and what his opinions are on those systems. Um, so in terms of what I've been producing, it doesn't make an enormous difference. But it means that I can begin to appreciate more of what he was like, why he wrote this, why he included what he did.
Mhm.
Um, so a big example of where his biography impacts the text is that although he was capable enough to write poetry in ancient Greek, his main vocation was a clinical psychologist specializing in sexual deviations in humans. And as a result, all of his literature is full of graphic depictions of extreme non-conventional sex, um, which is very prominent in the Astronautilia, and it's quite shocking in many regards. Homer famously is very coy and curtailed and insinuative, while the Astronautilia is bombastic and puts it right front and center. That was a major difference, and I was quite quite shocked to be reading such graphic visual descriptions of sex, both heterosexual and homosexual, which you do not really get in Homeric poetry at all. And now that I know he worked on sexuality in humans, I understand more of why he did that, why he found it interesting, what possessed him to repeatedly describe it within his epic.
Mhm. And now that, knowing what we know now, it's already known that he was in several fields. He was in psychology and he had many experience under the communist rule. And with all the science fiction, I mean, quasi because this is so out there, but which one of these do you think had the most influence in Astronautilia of these many facets of his life? If
Hmm. Um, that's a good question. I mean, we know that when he was even a teenager in school, he had an awesome memory and he could declaim hundreds of lines of Homer Greek, verbatim, no challenge. So this is it's a talent and an interest he's possessed all throughout his life to be well versed in Homeric poetry. Um, in terms of his vocations, I suppose the clinical psychology on human sexuality is apparent everywhere in the text, and you can't escape from it. But he was also a big fan of science fiction. And I've learned from his family, he loved Star Trek, for instance. And whenever Star Trek would broadcast in the UK, which I imagine will not be very often, he would lounge down in the living room in front of the TV and block the view from his family, like lying on his hip right in front of the screen. And unfortunately, because I'm not a huge fan of Star Trek, really, I don't get a lot of the references, but I can get references to when he's using Doctor Who because that's more my area as a Brit who enjoys the science fiction.
Mhm.
So I can see that his interests in modern culture and modern society are present in the text. I mentioned earlier his discussions of capitalism and communism, which of course you're never going to see in anything ancient at all. Um, so his life, his interests, his opinions find their way into the poem, and are put in the mouths of characters, in the mouth of the narrator, quite seamlessly. So that such that you can begin to understand his biography and his personality, I think, from the poem, what interests him, what he liked, what he didn't like, where he saw value in Homer, where he chose to change it, which Czech sci-fi authors he liked, which American science fiction he enjoyed. A lot of his interests do come to the fore in the epic, I would say.
Oh, great. And so something interesting that I've kind of noticed as I'm talking is if you do read Chesaldo's Wikipedia, part of what his interests were and like his real interests was he did have a, if you notice, he did have a tendency of translating very dense, obscure works. And that's exactly what you're doing with him. So there's kind of a weird, kind of a great symbolic, like almost, you know, reincarnation is the only, for lack of a better word, but that's something I've noticed, which is interesting. You're,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I could quite call myself the reincarnation of Jan
yeah, yeah.
Křesadlo. I have nowhere near the level of talent that he does. I can barely write prose in Greek, let alone verse. Um, yeah, he was himself interested in translation. He translated what's his name? Josef Seifert's, I believe, sonnet cycle into English out of the Czech. And this man, whose name I can't remember properly, was the first, I think, only Czech to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And that translation he co-wrote with his daughter as well. His other novels, his other poetry is highly multilingual. He quotes Latin and Greek, French, Russian, German, Italian, Spanish. He quotes, he has passages in some of his novels containing Roma. He has occasionally invented languages in some of his books. You
Yeah.
find quotations from all sorts of writers, from all sorts of periods, in all sorts of languages. You know this man is a polymath. You know he's a polyglot. Um, it works its way into absolutely everything. Even the Astronautilia has bilingual glosses in for Greek words and what they are in English, what they are in Czech, what they are in Latin.
Mhm.
Um, and neither none of those languages at all appear in Homer. He has invented this capacity, his preference to give the translations of various words into other languages. Like the word he uses in the Greek for computer is computer, but he also points out that the modern Greek word is hupologistes, and he gives the translation in the text. Like I don't actually know why he does that, but he does. Well, I had theories why, but he's quite interested in giving the renderings in other languages. So yeah, he's a polyglot. He's a polymath. I'm nothing of the sort. I'm just a enthusiast Homer and science fiction and of the obscure like this. I could not approach many of his works written in Czech, say, and produce anything like a half decent translation. I have been studying Czech. I know some Czech, but I could not do justice to them as I could to this text and the material which he's playing on here.
And what would you think um, played role in his decision to write Astronautilia in Greek rather than his native Czech?
No, yeah. I think I still don't entirely know or really have an opinion on why it is that he wrote this. He loved to write. He was a fantastic writer, and when he retired in the 80s, he dedicated himself to writing basically full time. Honestly, the best reason I could give for why he wrote an epic in ancient Greek is that he could. He could do it.
Mhm.
So why not do it? As far as I'm aware, the last time before the Astronautilia that somebody wrote an epic in ancient Greek was the very late 1800s, the early 1900s. I don't think it's been done otherwise in the 20th century. I think this is unique. If I am wrong, I would love to be corrected because I want to read it and translate it. But because it hasn't been done, why not do it himself? He had the capacity, he had the knowledge. He knew his Homer so terrifyingly well. He had internalized it so successfully over the decades that he could write effortlessly. And indeed, it was effortless because this epic of 6,600 lines of Homeric Greek, he wrote in 6 months, which is terrifying. We're told, for instance, that the Aeneid of Virgil, it's just under 10,000 lines. I think we're told it took him over a decade to write it. The Thebaid of Statius, which is I think just over 10,000 lines, that took him 12 years. And both Virgil and Statius are native Latin speakers; they're native Romans. Um, while Křesadlo is a Czech man who writes in ancient Greek and can write 6,500 verses in 6 months at the very end of his life. It's absolutely terrifying. By the end of the project, he was writing a book a day.
Oh my
There being
gosh.
24 books in total. It's really it's like it's scary. One of the many reasons why I would never put myself in the same category as him. I could not write an epic in 6 months. It's taken me 4 years to translate the ruddy thing. I could not compose anything original and so fantastic in so short a space of time.
That's very interesting because of that wide gap in time before people wrote epics in Koine Greek to where Astronautilia. So it sounds like he wasn't even doing it in Koine Greek for the, as the French say, fouts du jour. It was more just to display his ability and, as you know, as they say, art for art's sake, sort of.
Right, I'd say that's certainly part of it. I mean, he did choose to publish an accompanying Czech translation in the volume. So the way the book is paginated, the ancient Greek is on the left-hand page, and his Czech translation so it's facing it on the right-hand page. He's by no means the only poet to have written in ancient Greek. Plenty of people have written ancient Greek poetry in the 20th century. To give a example for me close to home, Oxford every year has a something called the Chancellor's Prize, where you're given passages of English poetry and asked to translate it into Greek and Latin verse, and that happens every year. Someone does it, somebody wins. People are writing poetry in ancient Greek. People today write poetry in ancient Greek. It's not unheard of. It's not that's unusual. It's rare amongst classicists, but it's not ridiculous. Where Křesadlo differs is that he wrote an epic. The epic is the unique quality, not the fact that he was writing in ancient Greek. The poetry which people tend to write in ancient Greek are epigrams. They're quite short. You may get an ode, which can be longer and often is more complicated because the meter is very funky. But writing anything above that, as I understand it, is very unique. That's very different. So for him, the difference is quantity of how much he's writing, not the quality of the language in which he is writing.
Ah. And what were some like unexpected moments or discoveries like upon your now coming in 4 years of working on Astronautilia? What have been the most unexpected, like, aha, or anything of this sort where during your work on it?
The text itself is so continually surprising because you never know how it's going to develop. It's always twist and turn. The problem with reading Homer, good as he is, the stories are now so familiar. We know the narrative of the Trojan War. We know the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops. It's not boring, but it's perhaps not as much a surprise as it could be because we have prior exposure. I knew nothing about this text when I began. There was no plot summary anywhere. There is now a very detailed plot summary on Wikipedia, which is useful for anyone who wants to learn more about the poem's content. But I didn't have that when I was writing this. I knew nothing about what each book was, so everything was a complete surprise, and there were some real surprises in there. So I think perhaps the most extraordinary book of the poem, without question, is book 19, which is mostly a speech by a prophet. And in this speech, the prophet explains how to do time travel, and he provides a model, a physical model for how time travel could work using the Mobius strip and some other, hand wave physics, which I just could not believe when I was reading it. I knew what the Mobius strip was already. I knew what he was talking about, but reading it, I was astounded by the ingenuity to have taken the Mobius strip and to have reused that to provide an elaborate explanation for how time travel works. To do it in ancient Greek, to do it in meter, to do it in the Homeric dialect, And to put it in at all, I was just astounded to read this. I still haven't quite settled my translation because I don't know how I'm going to do it. I don't know how I'm going to express a 200-ish line passage accounting for time travel in poetry. How will I make this clear to my reader without a diagram? Um, it really wasn't a wonderful few days as I was sitting through this passage, figuring out how he was explaining um, topology and geometry of this source in ancient Greek. It was wild. Um, and yes, time travel is an important feature of the poem, which, for a classicist, for anyone who reads Latin Greek poetry, is completely alien. You get nothing like time travel, as far as I'm aware, in the ancient world. This is a modern invention of science fiction. But to see that rammed into ancient Greek, into Homer's language, is bloody extraordinary and really quite incomparable. I don't think anything else approaches this. We have, there are modern works that blend Homer and science fiction. That's not unprecedented. But to do it in ancient Greek, yes, that is unprecedented. There is not really anything like that anyone has done in the past 100 years, as far as I can tell.
Great. And so do you think if Astronautilia was in the future, it could reach a much bigger audience, especially non-domestically, like into Britain, into America, into France? What relevance do you think this could cause? What do you think? What value do you think it could hold in readers into the future, given that this
Mm.
becomes widespread, like challenging it?
Well, yes, I mean, as goes my interests as a classicist, first and foremost, I was wanted to impress upon people the fact that ancient Greek is not a dead language. It's still a perfectly functional language. There is absolutely no reason why you can't write in ancient Greek. Why couldn't you? There may not be any native speakers, but you can still use it to communicate, to produce works of literature. And I hope, therefore, to show that classics is not dead. It is a rather vivacious, insatiable subject. There is always more to do, and there are reasons to learn ancient Greek and Latin, to study the ancient worlds, to read the epics. Um, and as a conjunction to that, because the poem blends, Greek mythology with modern science fiction, it would demonstrate well play with genres and with registers which writers can easily accomplish. I hope too it would illustrate that poetry is not always so arty and inaccessible and complicated. The plot of this poem is straightforward. Like it's not quite it's mad, but it's not a difficult narrative. So I would like it if it were to introduce a bit of a revival and to encourage people to read more poetry and to read epic poetry and things of the sort, which is regrettably a dying interest. But also, just more fundamentally, I want people to enjoy it because it is a very engaging text. It is extraordinarily bizarre. I have never read anything like it. Not only because it's written in ancient Greek, but the poem's content, the adventures that the characters undergo, the ways in which it's playing off so much literature and cultural material, all the references here, there, and everywhere. It's mad. I found no comparandum. Um, this is postmodernism before postmodernism. This is a really I'm running out of adjectives. It is a sui generis. It is a one of a kind, and I think people would enjoy to read something that is one of a kind, that is in a league of its own, through choice of language, through content, and perhaps through my translation until it gets usurped by somebody else who produces number two in the line of English translation of this text. I do hope there is one at some point.
Great. And both professionally in linguistics translation or just in a poetic sense, what impact did working on this and still working on this now did it or does it have on you?
Well, I think it's considerably improved my abilities in translation. I now view translation more as an art than an exercise. Anyone who has studied languages in school or university will realize that translation is an exercise performed for the teacher to prove you understand what the language says. And regrettably, an elegant, polished translation is not always so important, even when you're translating literary texts. And when it comes to Latin and Greek in particular, most of the texts read in any educational institution are literary. We're reading, the historians, the playwrights, the philosophers, the poets. But there's not always, to my surprise, an expectation to produce elegant, refined, proper translations, in English or whatever languages you're working with. It's more to show you understand the grammar, you understand the complicated subordination, you get the weird verbal form, rather than reading something that is pleasant, than as opposed to spiky and half formed. So having produced a poetic translation of a whole epic from line one to through to the end, it has improved my abilities considerably. I am a much better translator. I now translate for sake of style, rather than for sake of yes, an exercise. It's also just improved my Greek a lot as well. When you're reading so many thousands of lines of any language, your abilities in that language will improve dramatically. It really is, in that case, quantity. The more you read in any language, the more you expose yourself, the better you will get, whatever the language may be.
Right. And so it's crazy because you're in this position that I think is in the English speaking world rather rare, because where we have the internet, we have AI, we have Duolingo, we have whatever that makes in many people's minds translating far more easier. But you're still in a position right now where you're in the midst of translating something that in my mind could still become a classic once it becomes completed. So you're in this very unique chair in my mind. So more broadly, what are the main challenges and rewards of, exploring and translating very obscure works such as Astronautilia?
So part of the joy is that knowing that you're first, you're going to be the one who will inaugurate what you hope will be a very long and alive tradition of people reading and translating this text. It is very, very rare that any work in any foreign language receives a single definitive translation. It will be updated at some point. It will be changed because people's tastes evolve, as does your language in and of itself. Any translations of ancient texts from 200, 300 years ago are basically illegible now. No one uses them. So it is wonderful to think that you are at the head of this line, but it does come itself with a challenge that you don't have a translation to work with. Whenever you read Homer, you've got oodles of translations in any language that can help you clarify difficult points or obscure phrases. I haven't had that. The closest I've had is the accompanying Czech translation, which when I was starting off in this project, I couldn't read Czech at all. So I didn't know what it was saying. I would put it in Google Translate and get nonsense back because Google Translate is really bad and does not translate well. So really, I was just working on my own through the Greek, just through sheer brute force, trying to make sure it was as accurate as it was. And as I go back, I find I've made little errors here and there. It's nothing at a cataclysmic, but it's occasionally like, oh, I've used a singular for a plural, or oh, this is that case rather than this one. So that's always the risk. Like whatever mistakes I make, I pray that they don't get baked into future studies of the text, and that we don't all continually trip up because I myself slipped on some silly banana peel or whatever it is. So I like knowing that I'm first, but really, as I think I just mentioned, the greatest compliment that I could receive would be if somebody tried to outdo me. If somebody somebody reads this text and finds the Astronautilia itself interesting enough to warrant a fresh edition, and my translation not good enough, I'd be over the moon, because it means that having read my translation, they appreciate the work in and of itself, even if they don't like the way I've done it. So therefore, we'd have a dialogue, a debate, we'd have a narrative, rather than me sort of screaming into the void, throwing my pen and paper at people. and getting no reply, there would be somebody to talk to. There would be other readers. There would be variation. They may have a better interpretation of certain verses. I don't know. So if I get other people writing English translations of this, wonderful. Please be my guest. I shouldn't have a monopoly. Why should I? I'm nobody. I'm some random classicist from the UK who has a an obsession with Homer and science fiction. I'm not unique. I'm not special. I'm just bloody motivated apparently, and have too much time on my hands. Thank you, pandemic, for giving that to me. Um, so please, yes, I would love it if someone else took the reins. But I do derive satisfaction from knowing that, as far as I'm aware, I'm the first person to do it in English,
Mhm.
uh, and should be the first person to publish once I have found a home and my translation is up to scratch for more public consumption.
And so obviously, I mean, you told me about how all the challenges that it's taken, not just in translating it, but even like reading it, deciphering it. This has been a journey since right before the pandemic, and you've had to talk to
Mhm.
people, and it's been, it's been a big effort. And so, what advice would you give to other enthusiasts? It could be scholars or readers that are trying to explore works or trying to bring stuff to light that has been forgotten or overlooked.
Push the boathouse. Find something fun, something different, something that stands out and pursue it. Because you will not be the only person in the world, I would expect, who finds it interesting. You will have to work to make it interesting. You'll have to find justification and points of notes that others can work with. But I think it's a good thing to widen the scope of literature in play, the amount of text being read, rather than continually barking up the single tree, just working with the canon. If you're working with a text in a foreign language, translate it, produce it in English, because no one is going to sit there and read the whole thing in the original language if it's difficult. I've gotten plenty of interest in this text, having spoken to so many people about it, but not one person has read it. I had people casually flick through a few pages. Nobody has sat down and even read a book in Greek, as far as I'm aware. Um, they're not going to read it until it's made easy, and you make it easy by writing a translation and publishing it with the original text. The job of any writer is to make their reader's life easier, and having a translation coupled with the original work is the best thing you can do. Make it easy. And yes, have a good go. Find something fun, run with it. You will get people interested, even if the reaction is not one of undying fame or people as crazily enthusiastic as you may be.
That's wonderful. And then I guess lastly to finish off, I don't think there's anything more open-ended and more room for discussion than this question, which is obviously, this is a largely unfinished place. We haven't translated it, and putting into English from Koine Greek, Czech, whatever has been a challenge. So as of right now, of course, I'm aware that this answer may change in the future as you accomplish more and more with this project. What do you think the world should know about Astronautilia, or even with the author Jan Křesadlo?
Um, the thing that people should know about the Astronautilia and about Jan Křesadlo is that they exist. They are there. Because the challenge at this point is not convincing people the poem is interesting. It's letting people know the poem is real. Um, I would want the world to be aware of this Renaissance man, this polymath who was um, forced to emigrate to his home country and leave for Britain in exile, and that had history gone another way, he would have been one of the great Czech writers, certainly of the 20th century, perhaps one of the great writers of the 20th century overall. Once his works are translated. So to know that the poem exists will be my message. Read about it, learn about it, and when my edition comes out, work your way through it and see what you can find, because you will find things in the text that I have not spotted and that others have not spotted. There is so much going on. The only person I imagine who can appreciate and understand all of the angles of the Astronautilia is none other than the author. And regrettably, I'm not the author. So I am going to be an imperfect source myself. I want people to read it. I want people to read it, to appreciate it, but most of all, first of all, yes, to know it's there.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope I certainly learned from you. Hopefully we both learned something. And this has been very, very enjoyable. And I will definitely, Mr. Broadbent has written a very detailed article that kind of is a precursor to a lot of what we discussed, which I will share that in the description. And I will also share parts of his portfolio, which include his other projects. And Ben, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you taking your time.
Not at all. Thank you for having invited me.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much.